Okay, hello and welcome to this virtual presentation of explaining consciousness and its consequences. I'm Richard Brown, and this is a talk that I'm going to be giving at the CUNY Cognitive Science Speaker Series, August 5th, 2010. And what this is going to be a run-through of the talk, a rehearsal of it, if you will. Okay, so as a former graduate of the Graduate Center, the last time I gave a talk at the CUNY Cognitive, the last time I gave a talk at the CUNY Cognitive Science Speaker Series was in 2006, um, and I was the title of that talk was "Thinking Outside of the Box," and I was thinking about functionalism, this idea that propositional attitudes the mental attitudes can be captured functionally as contents playing certain roles. And towards the end of that talk, the core idea for the argument here presented itself to me, and I mentioned something about it towards the end of my 2006 talk, and we had a little bit of discussion about that. And that little bit of discussion puzzled me even further. So I wrote something up on this, and then I've in the last 4 years presented it at various conferences. So I presented a version of it at the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference. I presented a version of this at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness in Vegas. And I presented a poster version of it at the Society for Philosophy and Psychology in Toronto. So I've shopped it around. I've submitted a written version to a couple of journals, and still haven't had any luck with publication, but so I'm reworking it, and any comments would be appreciated, because after 4 years of thinking about this, I still haven't found an answer that's satisfactory. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I want to do is to present a puzzle for the higher order thought theory, and in particular the version of the theory as it's defended by David Rosenthal. So, I won't be talking about other versions of the higher order thought theory or whether or not this argument extends to them. I won't be talking about same order versions or anything like that, although I do think that you can formulate a version of this argument which covers them. So what I'm going to do for the purposes of this talk is I'm going to try to grant as much of David Rosenthal's theory as I can, and try to show that something puzzling results. So I'm going to be trying to use all the terminology in the way that David does. And so if you catch me using a term and you think it's not the way that David uses it, then let's talk about that, because I mean this to be the argument to be built from within the framework that David provides, because that's the framework that's led to the puzzle. So the basic puzzle then is that thoughts must have phenomenal feel, or else we ended up not explaining consciousness. So the basic idea that led me to this was that once you really understand the explanation of phenomenology that comes from the higher order thought theory, so once you've put together the full account that David presents for why it is the higher order thoughts bridge the explanatory gap, why they take care of or fully account for and explain the existence of phenomenal consciousness. Once you have that, and you accept it, you look at what he says about thoughts and beliefs, and you find out that he claims that there's nothing phenomenologically that it's like. And it becomes puzzling then why it should be the case that there's nothing that it's like. So now I've distilled the argument, I think, to its core form. So here's the argument in its simplest version. So it's what I sometimes call hot implies Pam. Pam there is a phenomenal aspect for all mental states, or phenomenology for all mental states. Really should be hot implies Packham, since it should be for all conscious mental states, but let's not get hung up on anagrams. So the first premise states something like a theorem of the higher order theory, namely that it's the higher order state that's responsible for there being something that is like for me. That's what accounts for that. And in particular, it's the content of the higher order state which determines precisely what it's like for the subject of the experience. So why isn't it the case that when I have a conscious thought, that P, why isn't it like thinking that P for me or believing that P? That's the basic puzzle. Why not? And it seems to me that if you deny that there is this consequence of the theory, you've ended up admitting ultimately that there is something special about qualitative properties or phenomenal concepts. They can't be explained fruitfully. And doing that ultimately gives up on the higher order theory of consciousness, and people like Chalmers and Bloch, who think that these things are simple, unanalyzable, can't be reduced, and then maybe something even more than physical, well, then they win. So what I want to do now is go through each premise of the argument. Now, if you're familiar with David's view, as I hope you are, then a lot of this will be rehearsal. But if you're not, then this is what I'm going to be doing now is laying out the higher order thought theory of consciousness in the way that David Rosenthal presents it. So the first step, if you want to explain consciousness, is to distinguish it from qualitative character and the intentional properties of first order states. So some theorists refuse to do that, and they think that consciousness is intrinsic to certain of these first order states. But what we do is we distinguish these. So for instance, instead of some unanalyzable property, blue, in phenomenal blueness, we posit something, a mental property, we call it blue star, and blue star is in the business of representing physical blue, the blue stuff out there in the world. Now, on David's view, the way that it represents stuff is not intentionally the way that intentional states do, but what he calls homomorphically. So basically what you have is a bunch of properties which vary and differ amongst each other in characteristic ways, and those characteristic ways are homomorphic to or preserve the ways that the physical family of properties vary. So the color family, for instance, well, you get various families of these. So the color family, for instance, will have properties which track physical properties in a homomorphic kind of way. So, and we'll just add a star to those to distinguish the mental qualities from the physical properties out there in the world. So, blue star is what David calls qualitative character. It's the property that that state has, in virtue of which it resembles and differs from other qualitative states. Now, there's also intentional states, or what we'll call loosely here thoughts. So, for instance, this is a perceptual thought, and in the case of a perceptual thought, one thinks that there is something roughly in front of one. So here, where Jerry is seeing blue, he has blue qualitative character, homomorphic property, as well as the perceptual thought that there is something blue in front of him, and that's a perception. Now, David's always hedged a little bit over whether he thinks that this is one state or two states conjoined with two different kinds of contents. He says, well, they both have their drawbacks, they both have their benefits. We can gloss by that debate, so I've sort of drawn it here in a way which suggests, well, maybe they're two states, maybe they're one state. Now, of course, these things can occur unconsciously, right? That's how we get a fruitful explanation, by separating consciousness from them. And on David's view, they become conscious when you have a higher order thought about them. So you can think that you see blue star, and that thought will make the blue star state conscious, and then it will be like seeing blue for you. And you can also think that there is something blue in front of you. Now notice there the content is different. You don't apply the blue star state, but the concept of blueness out there in the world. So now those two states um, uh, explain by implementing the transitivity principle, namely a conscious mental state is one that I am conscious of myself as being in, and I am conscious of myself as being in these states in virtue of my having higher order thoughts to the effect that I'm in those states. Now that's roughly the theory. Now it follows from that um, that unconscious mental states have no phenomenal feel, where that is just to say that there's nothing that is like for the subject that has them. So when this blue star state is unconscious, that is when Jerry just has his seeing of blue, but not a conscious seeing of blue, well, it's not like seeing blue for him. There's nothing that it's like for Jerry. Now, at this point, David sometimes distinguishes between what he calls thick and thin phenomenology. So, thin phenomenology is just the sense that, well, there's something that it's like to be anything. So, there's something that it's like to be the table. It's not very interesting, but there's something that it's like to be the table. But there's nothing that it's like for the table. So, here we could say, well, the blue star state has thin phenomenology, where there's something that it's like to have that state, but there's nothing that it's like for Jerry. Now, the same is true when he has his perceptual thoughts unconsciously. So when he thinks that there is something blue in front of him, so when he has his unconscious perceptual thought, again, there's nothing that it's like for him. There's no thick phenomenology in that case. Now, the converse of this is true. So, not only is in the absence of the higher order state, is there nothing that it's like for the creature, but what it's like to have the conscious experience is completely determined by the content of the hot. And David says this in numerous places. I cited just a couple of here, but what this amounts to basically is that even in cases where there is no first order state, but one has the higher order state, I think I see blue star, even in that case, what it's like for Jerry is just like seeing blue star, right? It's like a hallucination. He has the mental appearances there. It appears to him as though he's seeing blue consciously, as always seeing blue, but he isn't seeing blue, even though he does have a conscious experience of blue. Now, when people challenge David and say, yeah, but how could just having a thought account for phenomenal consciousness, right? People have never really balked at the idea that the higher thought model might explain how thoughts can become conscious, or it could explain how we introspect our mental states. But where people have balked is that the higher thought captures the phenomenology of experience. So here's what David has said in response to that. He says, my heart determines whether what it's like for me is, say, having a conscious experience of magenta or a conscious experience of some nondescript red. And since the hot one can make that difference, whether or not one has any relevant hot at all can make the difference between there being something it's like for one to be in a particular state and there being nothing whatever it's like for one. So the argument here seems to be that, well, we have evidence that when you apply concepts, it changes what it's like for you to have an experience, to have the experience. That seems to suggest that it's applying the concepts, it's having these higher order states, which accounts for there being something in the first place that it's like for you. Now, when I've presented versions of this kind of argument, that you can make this kind of move from it making differences in phenomenology to it accounting for phenomenology, I've got the typical response that I have received, check, is that there's a big difference between it making a difference in one's phenomenology and it accounting for the existence of phenomenology. So David Chalmers said something like that to me in response to this kind of argument when I was advancing a version of it. So how do we respond to that? Well, we can extract a kind of argument from David's work. So here's a quote from his paper explaining consciousness, which appeared in the Chalmers anthology. So he says, take the conscious experience of hearing the sound of an oboe. If one's hots couldn't classify one's sensations in terms of the sound of an oboe, but only that of some undifferentiated woodwind, having the sensation could not be for one like hearing an oboe. And if one also lacked any concept of the sound of a woodwind, what it would be like for one to have that sensation would then be correspondingly more generic. Continuing, he says, if one lacked even the concept of a sensation's being a sound, as against being of some other type of stimulus, having the sensation would for one be like merely having some indiscriminate sensory experience or other. This sequence makes it plausible that peeling away the weakest hot would result finally in its no longer being like anything at all to have the sensation. So this is what I guess I take to be one of the key arguments for the claim that the higher order thoughts can capture one's phenomenology. It basically involves a thought experiment of extracting away conceptual content out of these hots, and then noticing that an aspect of one's phenomenology disappears. So if one has the content of one's hot is, I am seeing magenta, then what it's like for one is like seeing magenta, a specific shade. Whereas if we have abstract out some content and go back just to, I am seeing some nondescript red or other, then what it's like for me to have that experience is to see some red or other. Now, presumably the first order state didn't change. It's the same. The only thing that's changed is the conceptual content of my higher order thought, and removing that bit of the content removes a sensory quality, what conscious sensory quality might say from the experience. Putting it back reinserts it. So it seems as though by reasoning this way, when you get to the point where you have just the most general higher order thought, I'm having some kind of sensation or other, what it's going to be like for you, it's just having some kind of sensation or other. Removing that means there's nothing left to what it's like. And then by inverse inference, we can then reason, well, applying it would then, in this incremental way, would then, first of all, introduce there being something that it's like for you, and then make it incrementally more rich. And something like that, of course, is maybe the way that David's view is, that we start out as animals with, we look at the range of animals without language to animals like us with language. Animals without language probably have only these very general concepts, and so have conscious experiences of a more generic kind than we do. And acquiring language allows you to acquire concepts, which allows you to have finer grained, higher order thoughts, which allows you in turn to have more detailed conscious experience. So now that seems to me to be the general argument. Now, what can we extract from this? Well, it seems to me that there's a general principle here, which is doing all the work. And the basic idea behind both of these quotes, and the basic idea I think that's in David's mind when he's saying these kinds of things, is that our phenomenology is a matter of mental appearances. So what we're talking about when we talk about phenomenology is just the way our mental life appears to us. That's what consciousness in this sense of the word is. We have a mental life, and in our mental economy we have different properties, qualitative characters, which distinguish the qualitative states from one another, and intentional contents, which can be put together, or, I mean, depending on your view about this, can be combined to form thoughts. And these things have their causal powers independent, independently of their being conscious, and they're sort of functioning and working down there and producing behaviors and stuff like that, and that's interesting. And then there's how that stuff appears to us. So there's the mental life, which is these two things comprise of them, and then there's how that mental life appears to us. And that's consciousness. That's the how it appears to us is what we're talking about. And since these other arguments basically make the case that the content of the higher order thought determines how things appear to you. So then now, having gone through this, I can restate my argument, I think, in these terms. So suppose that I have a higher order thought to the effect that I think that P, it should appear to me as though I think that P. Now, if it's really true that what phenomenology is a matter of mental appearances, and we grant that it appears to me as though I think that P because I have this higher order thought, and that determines mental appearances, then it should appear to me as though I'm thinking that P, and that means that it will be like thinking that P for me. Now notice that I haven't said, well, what is this phenomenology? I haven't said anything about it. I'm just saying that from the point of view of the higher order thought theory, it seems like it follows. What if it doesn't, then what we need is some kind of explanation. Because if we haven't, then we found some kind of really radical difference between qualitative states and intentional states. Because think about this. So here we have what for all intents and purposes could be a zombie from the point of view of someone like Dave Chalmers. So Jerry has a perceptual experience of blue here, but it's unconscious. So there's nothing that it's like for Jerry. There's nothing going on inside of him. There's no bluishness in there. It's not like seeing blue because he doesn't have a conscious experience of seeing blue. Now, if we imagine that Jerry was for all his life a zombie, we're blocking his higher order thoughts specifically, and then at some point we stop blocking them and allow the higher order thoughts to occur, suddenly Jerry's gonna have the Mary kind of experience. Oh, that's what it's like to see blue. Whoa, there's blue. Well, because he's been seeing blue all along, but without consciously. Right now, he's going to have his first conscious experience of blue, and he can introspect that and learn all kinds of interesting things about that. So there's going to be a difference in what it's like for Jerry from the time before when he had no higher thoughts to time now. Now, notice though that what's going on in the thought case when Jerry comes, say we are blocking his higher order thoughts. Well, when he comes to have a thought about making his first order state conscious that he thinks there's something blue in front of him, there's no change in what it's like for him. Now, that should seem very strange because look at the content of these things. There's really no difference. The only difference is that in one case you're applying the concept blue star, in the other case you're not. But that's supposed to make all the difference in the world. Whereas what the theory seems naturally to suggest is that, no, what it would be like for Jerry is like thinking that there's something blue in front of him. So he would be consciously conscious of the blue, which is like something for him. Now, how do people respond to this argument? That's right, that's the basic puzzle there. Why isn't it, according to theory, like something for him? Well, one might deny this by claiming that there's something special about the qualitative characters. They might say, well, those qualitative characters, they're special, qualitative. And so even when they're unconscious, even when we're not aware of having them in any way, there's still something that it's like for Jerry, right? There's still this thick phenomenology there. And we don't mean to be importing any excess or anything like that, so we can avoid the Blockian kind of worries. But we just mean, these people mean to say that, there's something that it's like for you, and when you become aware of it, then you're aware of what it's like for you, but it was still like something for you from before. Now, something like that may be Lycan's view. He goes back and forth on this, but you could sort of have a view like this. This is what Ned has been taken to recently calling the modest higher order view. Clearly one has given up on what's ambitious about the higher order theory in Bloch's terms. At this point, what's ambitious about the higher order theory is that we're trying to account for, explain, naturalize, demystify, whatever you want to say, phenomenal consciousness, phenomenology. Well, then what's left? If the qualitative characters aren't special, they're just homomorphic properties, and when we're not aware of them, there's nothing that it's like to have them. The phenomenal consciousness or phenomenology of having them is produced entirely by the higher order state. Well, then what's left is that there must be something interestingly special about the concepts, the starred concepts. They must be different somehow than the other kinds of concepts. But it seems to me mysterious what the difference could be. So, the starred concepts are simply descriptions. They're the same intentional kinds of, in the same intentional family as the other concepts that we apply in higher order thought. So all of these things are simply descriptive and intentional contents. That was the whole point. I mean, the starred concepts aren't special things. They're just the concepts we get from noticing that our experiences misrepresent. So they're not special. And of course, we get the concepts about mental states in a different way, according to David, than we get the starred concepts. We get the starred concepts by noticing misrepresentation of things looking one way and then actually being another. And we get the concepts that apply in our thoughts about thoughts from our command of folk psychology and automatically applying these kinds of concepts, first order concepts, to ourselves. So we get them in different ways, but both of these are subjectively unmediated. Both of these produce, or seemingly should produce, a mental appearance. They present my mental life to me in a certain way. That was supposed to be the big thing. Now notice that, see, part of this comes out in, say, various responses that David has made to people like Alex Burns. So Alex Burns says, well, you know, higher order theory, great attempt, but it's ad hoc ultimately, because what it ends up saying is, well, if these things are caused in the right way, then there's phenomenology, but if they're not caused in the right way, then there's no phenomenology. But of course, there's a response to that David has given, which is that no, it's not that they're caused in a right way, it's that we're trying to capture the mental appearances. We're trying to capture the mental appearances. And the mental appearances in this case, when we have conscious experience, is that it's subjectively unmediated and free from inference. Now, whether it really is a different story, but that's how it appears to us. So that's how the hot has to arise. Because that's what captures our phenomenology. Now, one might think then, well, you see, we have a response to your argument then here. You might say, well, look, we know from doing folk psychology that thought's like phenomenology. And so we simply mirror that, right? So someone might object, well, you're getting it backwards. You don't sort of start with the higher order thought theory and then see whether it predicts if thoughts have phenomenology or not. What you do is you start with folk psychology. You determine whether or not thoughts have a phenomenology. And then you just mirror that in the theory. So this would be something like the stipulation that hots must appear subjectively unmediated, right? That's the way it appears to us. What we're trying to do is capture those appearances. So then in the theory, we simply assert that. We simply put that into the theory. But not only did we have a response that was motivated by folk psychology and trying to capture the appearances, but we had a response that was motivated from thinking about higher order thoughts. So higher order thoughts produce mental appearances. We can get that from thinking about wine cases and the magenta and red kinds of cases. What they are in the business of is producing mental appearances. And so if we sort of notice that one happens by inference, it's not going to produce the correct kind of mental appearance. So it's not going to seem to us as though that state arises spontaneously, because we'll sort of notice that it doesn't. So if we notice that it doesn't arise spontaneously, it won't seem to us that it arises spontaneously, thereby not giving rise to a conscious experience of the right sort. So you can give a response that sort of, in terms of higher order thoughts and how they work, that differentiates thoughts that are caused in the right way and thoughts that are subjectively unmediated and not obviously the result of inference. So what can we do here, right? And Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. And the thing we appealed to was that phenomenology is a matter of mental appearances. And that does the explanation, right? That does the explanation for us. So, but that doesn't save us here. So, what can we say about higher order thoughts and their contents that isn't ad hoc or isn't simply just, well, but we have to stipulate that when you have higher order thoughts about, with that employ starred concepts, there's phenomenology, but when you have higher order thoughts that don't employ starred concepts, there's no phenomenology. Now that does seem ad hoc, so I don't think that this works. Now, I always like to think about emotions as a test case. Excuse me, as a test case here. And the reason why is because emotions, according to David's own view, have phenomenal feel. There's something that it's like to have a conscious emotion. Now, of course, he has this peculiar, in my view, opinion that, in my opinion, it's a peculiar view. That the phenomenal feel is not very prominent, and for instance, he says things like that to have a conscious anger and conscious joy have the same phenomenal feel, and they're distinguished more by their intentional content. So, for instance, the phenomenology of anger and joy is the same. What's different between them is that the intentional content of anger is that something is wrong normatively, and the intentional content of joy might be that something is very right normatively, perhaps. So that they have the same phenomenology, they feel the same, it's just that their intentional content is different, they're directed in different ways. Now, he's been ambivalent in his own work on how you construe the phenomenology of emotions, mirroring his ambivalence about perception. So one way you could think about emotions, and one way that David has suggested, is to model them on straightforwardly on his view about perceptions, which is to say that they're hybrid states, maybe one state, maybe two state, whatever. They're hybrid states that have qualitative character and this intentional content. So maybe there is a story we can tell about a distinctive kind of qualitative character, some kind of homomorphism story or something that we can tell about that qualitative character. And then when that qualitative character occurs with this kind of intentional content, the thought that something is normatively wrong, then you have an emotion. Now, another way to do it would be to posit a distinctive mental attitude instead of a kind of qualitative character. And that distinctive mental attitude would be such that when it was conscious, it results in phenomenal feel. Now, I'm not sure really what that would mean to postulate a distinctive mental attitude, unless that mental attitude was distinguished by some kind of qualitative character, which is, I guess, the way that I'm inclined to go. Now, if thinking about this, it seems, leads us to notice something sort of interesting, which is that all the considerations that we've been thinking about with respect to qualitative character, phenomenology, apply straightforwardly to thoughts. So notice, for the homomorphism theory starts from the observation that we use the same words to apply to the mental properties, the starred properties, as well as to the properties out there in the world that cause those things. So we call the flower blue, but we also talk about our blue experience, right? So we use the same word, one to refer to the property of the flower that it has, and one to refer to the starred property of a blue star, which occurs in us. Now we do the same thing with thoughts, and this is something that David actually points out in his own work. We talk about a book containing the thoughts of a famous philosopher. So we switch back and forth quite easily, using the same vocabulary, talking about utterances, sentences, and talking about mental states. Now, of course, the content of my higher order thoughts also determines exactly what it's like for me to have the first order states. So in the tip of the tongue phenomenon, for instance, we are conscious of some first order states, but not in enough informational specificity. So it can be very frustrating when you have these kinds of conscious experiences where you are aware of the first order state, that it's there, but you can't access his informational properties in the right way, and that's very, very frustrating. But it's I think just like the magenta and red case, it's the content of the hot is determining what it's like for me to have those thoughts. It seems like the explanation from phenomenology should apply straightforwardly. Again, it's mysterious why it wouldn't. So let me then close by sort of saying what I like to call a homomorphism theory for the mental attitude. So I kind of like to identify, as I was saying previously, I like to identify the mental attitudes with a distinctive kind of qualitative character. And this includes not only the emotions, but also thinking, wondering, doubting, believing, etc. So we can start out by noting what I just said before. We use the same words to apply to both. But we can also see, if we look, for instance, at a work like Zeno Wendler and his Res Cogitans, and you start looking through there, what you see is something that looks like a quality space where the homomorphisms are between mental states and illocutionary forces of utterances or sentences. So what I believe I can also state, what I know I can also declare or assert, what I doubt I can deny, what I suspect I can guess. Right? So there's this nice correlation there. And in fact, David has often talked about the rich causal connections between mental attitude and illocutionary forces of utterances or sentences. And so it seems to me that what you get are two families of properties, the illocutionary forces on the one hand and the mental attitudes on the other. And so you can use the one to identify the other in the exact same way as before, so that when I have an unconscious thought, it'll be some kind of qualitative character that has its distinctive functioning, coupled with intentional content in the right kind of way, and that'll have its usual causal powers. And then when you're aware of that, when you're conscious of that, you're now conscious of yourself as thinking that P. Well, then what it's like for you is like having that kind of qualitative character. Now, of course, it's not going to be like seeing blue. On my own personal view, thinking that P is like feeling certain that it's true. I think that if one thinks about one's experience, one will notice that there's a phenomenology of certitude. It just feels like something is true, feels like something isn't true. You doubt it, you suspect it automatically. Now, I don't have the time to elaborate on that, but I just offer that as a sketch or suggestion of one possible way that one could accept my line of argument and accommodate it within the higher order thought theory as already presented by David Rosenthal. Okay, so now as an addendum, I can't help but tack on here at the end some words about an argument that Ned Block has been formulating in response to his perception of David's changing his mind about the relational nature of higher order thoughts. Now, we all know that David never changed his mind. This has always been his view, but Ned has recently become aware of it, and he thinks he sees a new problem for higher order thought theory. So remember, this stems from this claim here, that in the case of the empty higher order state, what it's like for one to have the conscious mental state is determined by the content of the hot. So Ned likes to press this so that there's no actual state here. The mental state that's conscious is a notional state. It exists as the intentional content of the higher order thought. Now, Ned has recently pushed this as an objection, saying, look, the phenomenal consciousness exists in this case, but there's no higher order thought that produces that. And so what we have is a case of consciousness without the transitivity principle being implemented. Now, David's response to this is pretty straightforward. He says, well, in this case, the conscious state is a notional state. So it suffers from an intentional existence, but there's still a higher order thought. There's still a higher order thought, and so there's no problem, right? There's still something that is like for the subject. Now, Ned's response to this seems to be that what it's like for the subject can't be notional. It doesn't make sense to say that what it's like for the subject at that time is a notional thing. Now, I suggest that really this is because Ned's thinking in terms of peak consciousness as a distinctive kind of consciousness and saying, well, that property can't be a notional property, whereas David denies that peak consciousness is a distinctive property of mental states and instead thinks of phenomenal consciousness as just um, the way we are aware of qualitative states. Now, notice that's what I've been pressing. Once you make that difference and say, well, it's not a distinctive kind of consciousness, it's just what happens when you're aware of qualitative states, then you get my puzzle. Why does it happen in qualitative states and not in intentional states? Sounds like there's something special about qualitative states because there's this difference that's not accounted for by theoretical means, but has to be hand inserted into the theory in order to make it consistent. Well, my own view is to say, well, no, there is a property of phenomenal consciousness. Peak consciousness is a real thing. And you just identify that with the higher order thought. So the higher order thought is the peak conscious state, but the notional state is still what you would say that call the conscious mental state of the organism. So the transitivity principle tells you that a conscious mental state is one that you're conscious of yourself as being in. You can be conscious of yourself as being in notional states, so notional states can't be conscious. That's pretty straightforwardly an argument from the transitivity principle to the claim that there can be notional conscious states, but we don't have to say that the property of being phenomenally conscious is notional. That's identical to the higher order thought. So that's my tentative proposal to the solution. Now, at that point, you can side with David and accept, like I just outlined, that there are intentional existence. Or I think that there's another alternative here, namely adopting a causal historical account of the concepts that figure in HOTS. So you could give these kinds of states something like a complex demonstrative content of the form that I am seeing D that blue star, where the D that there determines what state has the property of being a mental, what state has the property of being a conscious mental state. It's whatever state the D that picks out. But what it's like for the subject is determined by the blue star state, blue star content, So you can have both. Now, in this case, you avoid the problem of the empty higher thought unless you think that these things can occur, that you can have these kinds of empty demonstratives. And we can discuss that. I mean, if you could have empty demonstratives, that's fine. Then there would just be no state that was that conscious mental state, and there would just still be phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so we can discuss all those kinds of issues in the discussion section.